I've had the honor and privilege of working with Chris for 26 years, and I can attest that behind her intellect and her passion for the work is an unshakable integrity. And I think that positions Chris to talk about risk management just about better than anyone I know. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Chris. One thing I just want to say is Chris has compiled questions from all over the agency. We've got tons and tons of questions. But if your question is not answered, please email me at llutz@fedcap.org, and I will make sure that we pose the question in the hour that we have. So Chris, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I appreciate that introduction, and I can't believe it's been 26 years, but that's actually a great statistic. So welcome, everyone. I'm to understand that there are lots of people who are participating today. I'm going to apologize in advance because I have a cough, and so if I start coughing, just wait me out. I'll be back, and I'll recover in a couple of seconds. And the best chance for me not coughing is to not make me laugh. So I'm prone to laughing, and that is what gets me coughing. So don't make me laugh. This topic that we're covering today, risk and risk management, is among my favorites for a lot of reasons, because I think oftentimes when we think about risk, historically we've always thought about risk in the context of high risk bad, low risk good, and I think that has really evolved over the last decade at least, in that a realization that risk is neither good or bad, it exists. And I like to think about risk in real simple terms as simply the absence of specific information. So I think about risk as those situations or environments or predicaments in which the absence of information is abundant, and mitigation is essentially trying to fill in the gaps of information. And if you can think about it in the context of risk being simply the amount of gap in your information or visibility, you come to understand that it's simply always there, and you should always be looking for it. And to the degree that we are able to evaluate sort of the amount of risk in any given situation, I think that is sort of the skill set that separates good outcomes from bad outcomes when it comes to engaging in our work. And I want to just sort of say that again so that it sort of sinks in, because I think at the most basic and simple level, if you can get that, I think it unlocks a whole lot of sort of risk evaluation, risk mitigation, so I think it unlocks a lot for you. So let me just say again that, in essence, risk isn't good or bad, and the relationship we have with risk should not be seen as good or bad, but rather risk being the lack of information or the lack of
We have a slight glitch. Chris, can you hear me? We're going to call in again. We have a slight glitch in the sound. Chris, can you hear me? So I'm assuming that people are typing in that they cannot hear you. So Chris needs to dial in again.
Can anybody hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
So the phone did this on its own. I was I have witnesses, in case anybody's thinking I pushed a button. I did not. You can see my hands right here. So my phone just leaped into something which made it, I guess, impossible for you to hear me.
We're all good now.
Okay, good. So I'm not sure where I left you all, but my intention here was really just to, at a very basic level, try to get you to think about the relationship you have with risk. And I think at the fundamental sort of level is to just think about risk as those sort of blind spots in your vision. So when you're dealing with either a strategic issue, an operational issue, a reputational issue, you can fill in the blank, big or small. The risk lies in the areas that are unknown to us. That's essentially how you should think about risk. And so again, it's not good or bad, it's simply there. And the muscle you're trying to build in the context of risk management is to be able to evaluate the landscape and not just see what you see, but build the skill set to see what you don't see, because that's where the risk is. And then, and hopefully that sort of clicks. Hopefully that basic understanding of risk clicks. So again, in each of these situations, asking ourselves, do we fully understand our risk exposure? Obviously, there's exposure in almost every set of circumstances we might encounter. What's really important for an organization or a department or a program is to have a sense of the sort of fully loaded risk exposure, because if you think about it, risk is everywhere, and so it's not just in isolation. And I think that's also an important consideration when thinking about, well, just how much risk can we tolerate at any one point in time. And so you have to imagine an organization our size. I heard a statistic recently that we had 300 active contracts, 300 contracts in motion. So that means there's a total risk exposure for the agency, given that there's a risk exposure quotient in each and every one of those contracts. And so think about that collectively now across the whole company. You can do that in your programs. You can do that in your division or your department or whatever you're representing. The other thing worth considering from a risk sort of on a high-level strategy level is the amount of exposure that we can have at any one point in time, and to the degree that our agency is equipped with what I like to describe as sort of risk apparatus, the ability to see where the risk lies. So how much risk do we have? What is our tolerance? And why is that important? Because if our risk tolerance is leveled at a certain place based on our organization's ability to manage that level of risk, it does dictate when and where and how we take on projects or decisions that we make. Has everything to do with, at the end of the day, the totality of the risk we can tolerate and the amount of mitigation that we can manage in motion. Now, I find this is sometimes where people begin to fear risk when it has to do with uncertainty, and so strategy is there's a lot of uncertainty in our strategy to begin with, so therefore there's a lot of risk. Managing risk in uncertain times, it adds a layer of skill that's needed. But what I would say is that the thrust of that skill has to do with our ability to constantly and without with continuous movement be adjusting our risk radar. So we're looking out always, not looking only for those known opportunities, the things that we know, but our ability to embrace and deal with what we don't know, what we don't see, but knowing that it's out there, being able to move toward in a direction where the actual picture is not fully formed. That's where the risk lies. The distance between you and that ambiguous distant future, whether that be a goal or a strategic direction. That's where the risk is. And our ability to keep fine-tuning our focus, identifying risk, mitigating, identifying it, mitigating, as opposed to thinking we're going to find a risk-free path, or as opposed to thinking risk bad, so, come to a full halt. That's not the nature of risk management. I'll just add a couple of things, and Lori, I wasn't sure how much time, for opening, but I would say that a key and important component of a good risk management framework really begins with a risk management mindset. And that is essentially what I was trying to describe in the first few minutes there, that your mindset around risk is 70% of what it takes to manage risk. It's that you are embracing risk, you understand it's out there, you understand the environment you're in. For example, in our organization, there are certainly political stressors, there's economic stressors, there's operational stressors, there's competitive stressors, there's a range of external pressures that come to bear on an organization like ours, meaning one that is large, it's growing, and we're not just trying to survive, we really are trying to make amazing things happen. When you try to set a course that engages our stakeholders in ways that they've never been engaged before, again, this adds additional layer. There are certainly organizations that exist and operate in a way that with certainty minimizes the risk profile, meaning they're not taking as many chances, they're not carving out paths that have not been carved out before. But of course, that's not who we are. And so that is what makes risk management so important for our organization. It's the very nature of our long-range strategy. As Lori said, it's to change the world. Well, that is with certainty not going to be risk-free because you're going to have to take chances, you're going to have to make mistakes, you're going to have to chart ground where there's been no one before. And so we're going to invent new things. We're creating new ways of thinking about how to solve problems in our communities. All of that constantly increases the risk profile of our work. And so our mindset around risk has to match that. It has to absolutely match the level of risk we are knowingly and purposefully jumping into.
Chris, I have a question here that I think ties to this perfectly. In some ways you've answered it, but I really like the frame of the question. Every person in the agency that registered for the event today received your white paper, New Risk Paradigm, that you and David wrote. And Ari, we're not ready for reputation yet. And in it you say this: risk management requires a forward-looking approach, one that is integrated with business strategies and goals to achieve measurable results in a continually changing environment. So a really great statement. But then the question is this: can you give us one example of how you and maybe the board and you and or organizational leaders have been able to look forward and plan ahead to mitigate serious risk to the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the important components about what that piece Lori just read, which I think can't be underscored, is this notion of forward-looking. A lot of times when you hear about risk management or even things like compliance, or what we're really doing is focusing in those structures. Sort of describe it as looking out the back view window. You're not, when you drive a car, you can't drive a car looking out the back window. So the rear view, in my mind, is about learning. It's about not making the same mistakes twice. It's about taking all of what went well and didn't go well, but that it's applying it in the in an integrated manner, in the forward-looking strategy that you're building. And so an example, there are large examples, there are small examples. let me give you a small example just in the context of a recent contract rollout that we had in New England. This was we won a contract, and in the context of that work, in looking out the front window, trying to contemplate this highly strategic set of circumstances. This contract was was highly political, it was public-facing, it had a lot of detractors, so, we won something, but not everyone in the community was for it. In fact, there were people adamantly against it. There were others who were politically against it, and so I won't do justice to it, but it was a landmine of potential issues over and above the facts that were necessary, just to logistically open up or roll out the contract. So an example of how we did manage this was, in addition, as we were talking about the implementation of this, risk and the risk profile became probably one of the most important components of the implementation. So rather than just talking about how we're going to implement this logistically, we needed this many sites, this many staff, we had to have this many services online, all of that true. But that's not where the risk profile for that part of the work. The risk that was relatively high were the political landmines that we were facing. And those were all unknown. And this is why it's such a great example, because what we knew was that there was a high profile of risk, that it was ambiguous in nature, it was political, it was the likes of a community, but that failure in those areas could make or break us, meaning we would not succeed or fail because we didn't get an office open on time. We would succeed or fail in part because of the many nebulous landmines that could go off at any point in time that could create anything from us ending up on the front page of the paper as a subject of a negative article, used as a pawn between political foes who, some for and against the project we ended up winning. Hopefully I'm describing it in a way that gives you an appreciation for the kind of risk that was out there. But it was all unknown. And so our job was to run scenarios, and this is more of a technical sort of skill that I think one develops. It's a strategy for risk mitigation, and that is to, as part of your planning and implementation, we had to run through 40 separate scenarios that might have emerged. Because again, what you're looking at is forward window, and it's unknown. We don't know where the risk is completely. We know the range of risk, and we hopefully can get better and better at contemplating the range. But what we needed to do was run through scenario after scenario after scenario and expose all of the critical paths for potential risk. And even in doing that, we would not have believed to catch them all, obviously. But in doing that exact activity, that sort of set of looking out there and contemplating all the risks that might be there that we can't see, we're able to shore up various mitigation along the way. And in fact, absent that exercise, we might have done things completely different. So there are things that we would do that you might ask, or some even on the team would say, oh my God, why are we doing all of that? That just is taking us so far to the right, we don't need to do it. But of course we did need to do it. And it may not be visible to everyone why something needs to get done, but chances are, if people are taking extraordinary direction and adding extraordinary sort of layers to a project, it's quite possible that what they're doing is, having ran scenarios of potential risk exposure, they're using those additional activities to shore up the potential and minimize the risk as you go. Hopefully that was a good example, because it was...
Yeah, that was great, Chris. Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions around the title, which was Risk Management is Everyone's Role, and probably just simply put, the question is, how can everyone across the organization really be involved in risk management? How, at whatever level, do I have a role?
Yeah, that's something that I think just from a development, a person developing in their career, they're always, people are always wondering, what are some of the more important sort of skills, or what are some things I can do to enhance my marketability or my effectiveness and the like. I would put for any individual in the workplace, in any position, at any level, your ability to understand and manage risk is a defining characteristic. It's a defining characteristic, and by that I mean it separates the folks that have high skills in very discrete areas, but perhaps don't excel. This is one of those defining characteristics, your relationship with risk. Now, don't confuse risk management or the ability to see risk with this notion of naysaying. And I think it's not part of your question, I realize, but naysaying or no or finding the fault in everything is not the same as risk management. So think of those as separate. There are lots of people can point out flaws. That's also a skill set in some ways. People who are able to see danger and flaws, and many of those people who can do that sort of end their relationship there. So they are people with a set of optics and a mindset that is sort of defensive in nature. Risk management, and to the extent that it's everyone's role, it's everyone's job, I'm thinking of it in two ways. One, in an organization like ours, it's critical that people at every level of the organization have a positive and very specific relationship with risk, because it's only when the entire organization is engaged in active risk management that we are minimizing the risk that we are dealing with at any one point in time. Obviously, if it's only 3 people's jobs, there's going to be a lot of gaping holes. And so, 4,000 people with a positive and proactive relationship in risk management really leaves only minimal unexposed areas. And that's the nature of this. We are trying to fill in all of the front window gaps. And so whether you're the person who's emptying the trash baskets at the end of the night, or you're the person building the entire strategy for the company, you and everyone in between, this responsibility for risk management is essential. Now, part B of that, or what I opened with, was being among, I would say, 3 or 4 defining attributes or characteristics. And your ability to keep building those muscles that allow you to look out way far ahead, way down the road. Again, being able to look ambitiously down the road, even when hardly anyone can see what's fully formed down there. You might not even see it fully formed. And your ability, almost like radar, think of it like the radar at the control tower at the airplane. Their eyesight and their ability to see blips on the screen is so much more advanced than ours, because we're not doing that every day. So they're doing that every day. They see blips where we don't even see blips. Or think of it like the guy who reads your x-ray. Have you ever been at the doctor's office and they put the x-ray up on the wall and they start talking a mile a minute about everything they're seeing, and all you see is a big blurry mess? You can't even recognize the body part. Actually, they can tell you have an infection. They can tell this. They can tell that. That's an acquired vision. That's a set of muscles they've been developing over years. And in many ways, our ability to keep understanding the environment in front of us and being able to see those places, not that should bring us to a halt. Most of the risk that we're looking at is simply exposure that we should be scooping up and mitigating as we move forward. Now, surely there are things where you'd stop dead in your tracks and we'd discover something that would stop us dead. I'm not saying that never exists. I'm saying that our relationship with risk is so much more than that. That risk is thousands and thousands of spots as you look down the road, all of which need scooping up and mitigating, because the direction we're heading is that way. And, you know, we're going there. And so being that person, being a steward of that at every level of the organization, independent of your job, title, it's essential to our combined success, number one. And I'm trying to reinforce, I guess, in this that it is one of those defining characteristics that will separate good from extraordinary. And I would put that out there as one of those areas.
Well, this is an interesting follow-up question to this, Chris. It says, as an employee, what do I do? What do you actually consider to be risky behavior? And in other words, what behaviors, actions should we avoid in the workplace? And the second question to that is, and if I see a problem, what should I do? So people are taking it now down to their real personal day-to-day level.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in the way you frame that, let me answer it in three buckets. First of all, if you see something that seems worthy of communication, and by that I mean, again, going back to the definition of risk is everywhere. I walk from here to the bathroom and there's a piece of paper on the floor. That's risk. I should pick it up. It doesn't matter. I don't need to report it. I don't need to do it. I need to pick it up. So there's a whole level of risk around us that simply requires our good stewarded action. It requires you remove that risk immediately. It's in front of you. And picking up a piece of paper, it's not really an exaggeration. I walked to the floor, walking to the bathroom, I noticed the floor is wet. That's a risk. I don't need to, I fix it. So there are that first level of risk out there that we should all be looking at, and it doesn't matter who we are, we can fix that. We can fix a lot of risk as we see it. And our relationship with risk should be just that. Now, if I see a drip on the floor and I notice that it's actually coming from the ceiling, and that requires something more. I'm not going to just wipe that up. I've got to wipe that up, and now I've got to do something about that. And I want to use this one as an example because I want to carry it full circle. Because reporting it is an obligation. I would say, look, you see there's water leaking on the floor. Your job is to maybe protect the area right then and there, no matter who you are. Then you want to make sure that that problem can be rectified. I want to take it one step further. Each and every one of us, what happens if the next day that water is back on the floor? You see, and don't take me so literally. I'm not talking about just on the floor. I'm talking about anything from we didn't treat an employee properly, or we didn't pay a bill, or we didn't anything that we didn't do. Even when we can scoop it up and fix it, our obligation is to take it through the cycle so that we have actually rendered it non-harmful to us in the future. And that is an obligation of risk management that is worth underscoring. So that that's the first swipe of risk management and what you should do about it. Then there's the kind of risk management that perhaps was more in line with the question as you intended it, which is to say integrating the risk profile in your day-to-day operation and in your day-to-day strategic thinking is essential. And that's what gets you in front of it. So it doesn't really matter what you're doing, whether you're dealing with a client starting a program, any set of activities you might be doing in the workplace always has to be put in the context of, quite specifically, what is the risk profile of this action I'm taking? That should be as consistently part of your thinking. What is the risk profile? So again, this is front window in nature. Whether you are building a structure, understanding what that structure is meant to accomplish and what risk scenarios is it meant to address. That should be hand in hand. When you're building something, when you're implementing something, any time that you are engaged in any active operational or strategic forward movement, among the things you need to be asking yourself is, what is the risk profile and what are the various scenarios for mitigation? Now, if in doing so, you may need to think through and engage others in that proactive discussion. And I would hope that in every single department, in every single program, every single manager has built a risk profile discussion into their operational and strategic organization. I don't care if it's a program, an agency. Visible risk assessment, risk scenario building should be as visible to every employee. And if it's not, you should raise it. You should raise the question. Because by now, that should be completely constructed everywhere across the company, and it should be part of your everyday language. Now, the third bucket, here's where it might get people nervous, where you're seeing something and you believe it's risky, and in this category, you're nervous about it and you're not feeling as though you're being heard. Now, that's a different kind of question. So first swipe it, what do? Fix it. See a piece of paper? Pick it up. See a drip on the floor, somebody could slip on it? Clean it up. Make sure you take it to the next level and that you've assessed its propensity for continuing and get to the root cause and fix it. 2, integration of your everyday work should involve risk scenario planning, and that should be embraced in your program, your department, your practice, your division, your company. And if it's not, raise it and keep raising it. And perhaps, send an email off anywhere to a person that has control over this, including me, to say, I'm not that clear on our risk management framework in my department, and I've raised it, but I'm not getting anywhere. I'd like to be more knowledgeable in this, and that will at least help some of us who are in charge of making sure that leaders are engaging in this. Now, see something that you think is risky and wrong. That's an entire, and that's the nature of the question. Then, there are many ways to deal with that. One, I would begin with your immediate area. Obviously, if you see something that you think is quite risky, I would raise it, and I would raise it in writing, and I would bring it forward. And if you feel like you're not getting anywhere with that, I would go to the next level and raise it. The occasions where we have engaged in risky behavior and where it has come back to bite us have always been about collective lethargy, meaning I cannot tell you how often it happens where everyone knows we're doing something in a way that is not in our best interest, and no one says anything, and they just proceed forward, and everybody knows it. Those are the worst, because we had the power to fix it. And saying nothing is as problematic as actually doing harm. I consider saying nothing the same as harming. And so I hope the 3 levels makes it, simplifies it a little bit, because it's not just one thing. It's, not all risk is the same. Our obligation for mitigation is not all the same. So There are levels of risk. There are things that, like, immediately you should ring every bell in front of you if you see it happening, and there are other things you should just pick up the paper and put it in the garbage. Does that make sense?
I think that was just amazing, Chris, and I think those 3 buckets really make it, you could reach a hold of it. You understand exactly what you're saying. And so before we move into the reputational risk piece, someone actually asked the question, as an organization and parent company to many nonprofit agencies, how are we doing on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being we are highly effective managers of risk and 1 being not so much? Mm-hmm. How do you think we're doing?
Well, 3 years ago when we, maybe a little bit more now, but 3 or 4 years ago, we began a very proactive and visible conversation about risk. At that point in time, I would have said we were ahead of the curve. When we began talking about risk, we were, I think, doing something that most organizations, certainly in the not-for-profit community, but I would say across the whole area of certainly social services, but perhaps even beyond that, that a healthy, proactive, front view window conversation about risk was, we were a little bit ahead of our time. So I would say the conversation itself brought us to a level of maturity that I think we could have all been proud of. I would say 3 years later, on a scale of 1 to 10, I still find us to be very much now at a 2 or a 3. I find that in the last even 24 months, I am still struck by the lack of infrastructure that is necessary, would be necessary to mitigate risk. And that I'm fairly surprised, to be honest. And so I say we have a lot of work to do. In short, we have a lot of work to do. And again, it's the responsibility of every person to be seeing themselves as a risk manager. However, I said this 3 years ago, and I think I've said it every month since then, that it is the responsibility of the leaders of the company and the leaders of those domains, in particular where the highest risk exists, to shore up structure that is proactively contemplating all of the risk and controls necessary to keep us from to overexposure. And I would say on a scale of 1 to 10 today, 3 years later, we should be a lot further along. And that's something I take very seriously and want to continue to put pressure on the leadership to show the structure that's in place for global risk management. And I would say we're still a long way off.
That kind of ties in some ways with, we got a question from the MVLE team. And you've talked about ensuring that a risk profile is part of every program, probably every decision, every next step. The MVLE team, in some ways you just answered this in part, but I just want to put a fine point on it, said, how do we integrate the risk management plans for the brands and the practice areas with the corporate risk plan? In other words, how does it feel like it's an integrated plan and not a disparate set of activities that are unrelated?
Right. That that is about structure. And so when you think about if collectively we all ask the same set of questions, we may not have the same answers, and each piece of our organization doesn't represent the same risk profile. But if every time we're building a set of structures or procedures, we are all asking the same set of questions, that is what's relevant, is that we ask the same types of questions, and that integrates across the company. So to put it in practical terms, for example, I know in some areas we're expanding, I'll use a concrete example, we're expanding our Medicaid billing profoundly, and third-party insurance billing. And so that's an area that it's an opportunity we had to expand and build out structure where none had existed. Let's use that as the example for a second. As we're building that structure, if we are not spending an enormous amount of time discussing what risk profile Medicaid billing brings to bear, documenting all of that, and then as we build structure for Medicaid billing, think of all the places where Medicaid billing can cause us grief. Among them, we're not billing all that we're owed, or we're billing for things we shouldn't be billing for, or we're billing incorrectly. So I don't have to, we could spend a whole call just on all of the ways Medicaid billing can get us in trouble. Now, we should spend as much time talking about all those ways, because as we build the structure, the framework to engage in our Medicaid billing, we would want it to be built against surely a set of goals, a set of KPIs, but also an established risk profile. So that has to be built right alongside everything else that you would use to build your Medicaid billing structure. Now, I just used Medicaid billing structure. Go back to the contract we deployed. I'm going to deploy this contract. What's the risk profile? And you can take that question, what's the risk profile, and that can be broken down into many types of risk profiles, meaning subcategories, your strategic, your operational, your reputational. I mean, there's an endless subcategory that make up a risk profile. But if we're always asking that same question, that starts to assure that all of the things that we're standing up, they're not just a separate and isolated set of risk mitigating. It's integrated into every piece of structure we build. Has to be in a context of what is the risk profile for this set of activities, and how are we using the structure to mitigate and close the gap of exposure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, and I think that these pieces are really tying together the fact that risk is a personal responsibility. The management of risk is a personal responsibility, and there are tools, there are strategies, there are techniques, there are communications that occur, but it can never occur in the absence of personal accountability for it. So this has been, I think, really interesting. And now we move into the next category, which is reputational risk. And there's a statement, it says, that I thought it would be worthy to read on the slide before we're on right now. Ari, if you could flip it back. A reputation that took decades to build can be threatened by a single event. And we've actually seen that in recent years. Mm-hmm. So a couple of questions that individuals asked, and there's a lot of things but there was a lot of questions around the concept of social media, and not only about employees' sort of responsibility on social media, but the risks that we encounter generally with social media. And I wonder if we can just talk about that. I think that could be valuable.
We can dive into social media as it relates to reputational risk, but and I do think that that's a fairly wide open set of circumstances, and some of it is so obvious, as you just think about all of the many debacles that have played out from, I'm reading recently about a political candidate with really, elaborate sort of expectations about, in this case it was a he really had some big plans, and something emerged on social media where he had been, dressed inappropriately or had done something inappropriately, and it has essentially ended his career. So, some 10 years ago, such and such, he went to a party, he did something inappropriate, it was caught on social media, And today, 10 years later, he will now fall from a fairly high perch in which a high office was really his next move, and all indication that he was going to be going places in terms of his political aspirations, and it's completely gone now. It's over. So there are so many of those. They almost seem. It almost seems to me like that's not a lot of unknown anymore. What you do and say in social media, if we're not clear on that today, meaning if you're a person in this world today and you don't understand that what you do and say in social media matters, and it will matter not just today or tomorrow, but it will matter to you in social media didn't exist until I was long past the age where anything that could be captured would be a problem. So it is an enormous burden today, I think, and it's hard to blend. This was, think about the blending of social media in terms of, in the old days, your personal life was your personal life, your work life was your work life. That is just not true today. It's just not true today. I was reading an interesting article, though, that people under a certain age have come to understand that whatever goes out there remains with them forever, and there's a sense amongst this particular generation and younger that it won't matter because everyone will be in the same boat eventually, meaning at a certain age, everyone's behavior from the time they were 7 years old till, they're in their 50s will be recorded in social media somewhere. And so that perceptions about how bad it is will change over time. We're certainly not there today, and so we're still in that point today where what happens in social media matters. Now let me shift for a second and think about social media in a more formal and traditional vehicles where there's risk for us, and that is this. What people say about us in social media, and by that I mean all forms of social media. So there are a broad range of places where people will be representing the values and the characteristics of either the Fedcap, the group, or any of its parts in places where it matters. And so it's not any longer a big risk. It used to be you just worry about getting on the front page of a paper in the wrong way. Now, when someone releases something about your company or about a leader in the company, it is everywhere, and it takes on a whole life of its own. So that the degree to which we have to guard and protect against failed infrastructure, the consequence is quite high now, because it's not when and if it gets communicated, it is no longer isolated. So when we do make a mistake, when we do something and get and have an exposure, that exposure now has legs for decades. Before, the legs, the worst you could say is it got into the newspaper, and unless you happen to be reading a newspaper from 1982, you'd never see it again. That's not true anymore. And so just like people have to live with whatever happened to them, whatever they happened to do when they were, 25 years old, they might be still living with that at age 50. The same is true of our company. And so it makes, to me, it even more important that we understand, and I know we're going to talk about reputational risk in broad terms, but the stakes are so much higher today because the information that represents that failure that never goes away anymore. It used to go away. It never goes away. And so when we are careless with our reputation, when we are careless in terms of recognizing what is risky behavior and ensuring that we're not engaged in it, the consequences because of social media have an entirely different result for us. And that should linger in your brain for a minute. So the same mistake 20 years ago had a beginning and an end. That exact same mistake today can never be overcome because it never goes away now. That's the risk in social media for us. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that this concept of several people brought that up in relationship to social media, the whole idea about how do we manage what people are saying about us? How do we manage and correct misnomers? And it's challenging, but there was enough questions around that.
Right.
I just wondered if you have some thoughts around that. How do we manage things that people are saying about us?
That's another whole dimension. So, you have this notion of actually what we do and say matters, and, it's as individuals and as representatives of the company. Then you have the second bucket in which I'm saying, the same mistake made 10 years ago has a different consequence today because of social media. So this is a very dangerous, the stakes are higher when you choose to be risky with your structure or behavior or take risks that we shouldn't take. They have long leg consequence. Now you have these platforms where organically people can put actually false information out. Let's even go that far, meaning there are people who might, say, leave a company or who are competitors who engage in social media sort of attacks. And to the extent that we can guard against that, I mean, that's probably the trickiest of all. Lots of reasons to ignore some things. There's lots of reasons to simply ignore it. But I think there's collective and organized, and we've not engaged in this a whole lot as an organization, but I would see in the future this being a very valuable tool. An organization like ours might have framework in place that allows for, encourages, and almost institutionalizes the bombarding of positive thoughts out there on the various social media platforms. And so where, for example, I know we've had occasion to look up in various sites places where people are looking for employment, and they have profiles, GuideStar, these kinds of places. Occasionally you can find organizations where the only thing listed there is a series of negative statements by a handful of employees. Well, those are easier to guard against in that you can combat that with of our employees, flooding those very same pieces of framework with positive messages. And it turns out, I think people have come to understand a lot of times people with negative feedback are the ones who go to some of those places, and so unfortunately you end up with a lot of negative things, which does not represent the company. But I think we can proactively use many social media vehicles to promote positive statements about our organizations. And at the end of the day, we are what we deliver in the community. And I think I tend not to fear the general social because my money is on our 4,000 plus employees in the community every day, doing good, engaging with families, engaging with community, being good neighbors, executing extremely well. And it's by those reputational activities that I believe we will prevail in terms of the hearts and minds of the people in the community.
Thanks so much, Chris. There's a couple of other questions around reputational risk. I wanted to cite this study by Deloitte and Forbes Insights surveying 300 executives, mostly C-suite, and boards of directors, and found that reputation is considered to be the highest impact risk area to business strategy, and that cuts across sectors, et cetera. And so maybe in summation, it might be a good thing to talk about what do you think are two or three things that we are doing on an ongoing basis that really are attending to our reputation, attending to the risk associated with the reputation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. In a way, I think about reputational risk as not separate from any other risk. Meaning, I think of it as the ultimate consequence of risk. And by that I mean, in this the way typically you frame reputational risk, it's sort of reputational harm is what we're really talking about, harm to our reputation. Every area of exposure has the potential to harm our reputation, and that's why I was sort of trying to braid those things together, where I say, at the end of the day, a mistake, that is a technical mistake, something we did or didn't do in the old days, might have not even left the company from an information standpoint. Our reputation wouldn't have been compromised because we could have contained it. Number one, you cannot contain the information today based on the social media, but also based on the fact that the external compliance and the regulators, when they're involved in any mistake we might have made, issue findings now that are also in the public domain in ways that they were never before. So what I'm saying is reputational risk is not this separate and apart kind of risk. It is the natural consequence of any risk. So including the piece of paper on the floor. That piece of paper on the floor that somebody slips on has a direct line to our reputational risk. And so every risk can lead to reputational risk. And it's not separate. And you've got to kind of understand it more as the ultimate result of failure to mitigate at all levels or to engage in risky behavior. Doesn't matter what it is, it's all reputational risk, because that's the degree to which it can get to today, and far more rapidly than ever before. So I would say, and it's the most damaging risk of all, meaning there is, to the degree that something that could have been avoided or mitigated, or any level, anything that we could have done to suppress it or to avoid it, along the way failing, ultimately it leads to reputational risk, all of it. And that is the most difficult type of exposure to overcome. And back to my first point, it's more so today than yesterday, based on the social media sort of nature of things. It is no longer contained. Again, I want to emphasize that for those of you, who were around, you got yourself on the front page of a paper, and you were devastated. And then 6 months later, pretty much you could be assured you're getting over it, unless you're, Tylenol and you've poisoned half of a town. But even they got over it. Even they managed to get past that. Today that's not true anymore. So your reputational risk has to be guarded with such extraordinary management, because it doesn't go away. The legs last decades now. So I can think of all kinds of things that we took chances on that we shouldn't have taken chances on, and we didn't understand it wasn't just the immediate risk it presented and the immediate problem it presented for us, but that problem now morphs into a decade-long problem. And that's where we fail to understand the connection between the small things and these long-range reputational risk problems that we can build for ourselves. And the biggest, the way to combat against this is, one, get it right. Understand what. Do not engage in unnecessary risky behavior. Understand the long-term consequences, not just the short-term consequences, and realize how important protecting our reputation is, because once it begins to slide, clawing that back has never been harder. Just go online. You can see what happens to people. It mushrooms in ways that it never has before. That should make us all the more frantic at the front end to better have our sights on risk exposure, mitigate against it, be stewards of risk in front of us, do not take risk for granted, and because ultimately could be sending us down a path that is in the worst place, which is this out there in the public domain reputational risk. Now, at the end of the day, notwithstanding really bad blunders, and by the way, we've made several of them just in the last 24 months, I would say that the way to combat our reputational risk is to build a pool of equity. When we are in the community, most of our work is in the community, and that is where people are going to build their frame of reference about us. And I go back to execute well, be the organization that is a cut above the rest, be the organization that goes the extra mile, be the organization, be the department, you fill in the blank. You be the group, you be part of the group, you be part of the person, you be the person that if someone's looking for one, we deliver two. If we are taking that extra step every step of the way, internally and externally, to be building a reputation of the people who go the furthest, who do the most, who care about our community the most, and who execute the best at the highest level. And I think that is the best, among some of the ways that we combat this reputational risk. I know we're coming up on the time, Lori, so I don't want to keep unless you tell me.
Well, no, what's great about what you just said is I think it answers your question, Sarah. I think Chris's last comment was one really of empowering. I think the question that was posed was, how do we focus on risk without creating kind of this culture of fear? And it's the opposite. It's the absolute opposite.
Right. Again,
yeah.
Think of risk as a muscle. You're building a muscle. So, I would wear it like a badge of honor. Your ability to look out the front window and shore up all of those possible scenarios. Now, again, separate that from naysaying. We're not fear-mongers and naysayers, though. That has nothing to do with risk management. Risk management is about tightening your optics, going through all of the various landmines that could be out there, not for the purpose of retreating, for the purpose of safely advancing. And all we're doing is getting better and better and more focused around what are the possible scenarios that are out there for debacle. By the way, there's always twice as many as you think. That's the environment. We're not going to do away with that. That's not going to go away. What we're going to do is get better and better. Imagine each one of those being neon. Now they're not ambiguous anymore. Now the risk, by the virtue of the fact that you saw it, the risk is mitigated. Just that you saw it, the risk has already begun to mitigate. And that's what we got to get good at. Not fear it, not pretend there's a world without it, not run away from it, and by the way, not just leave it there hanging. Don't leave the water on the floor and walk away.
That's great. That's just great. And I think it's encouraging to know that Mia and the Central Texas folks already have decided to add risk management discussions in their monthly meetings with their team as a standing agenda item, just to make sure that the whole concept isn't lost. So that's great. And the other thing, I was just going to say, the other thing I wanted you to know, and this is to everyone, thank you. We blew the lines out. We have no more lines. People tried to get on, and we have so many people on the call today that we have to add more lines, more Adobe, more everything. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Did you have a final comment, Chris?
Just to say, I really appreciate everybody's interest in this, and it's very, very encouraging, and it's not until all of you stand up and start, shaking the cage, talking about risk every day. I would welcome any emails, questions, anything you want to do to communicate with me or with the group at large. The more we can talk about risk, the better we all are. And I would love to see some juice, generating from people about risk profile and how we're addressing it and what we're doing to execute in ways that mitigate the risk around us. And I would welcome any communication on the topic.
Great. Well, there's lots of great comments pouring in from the bottom, and really appreciate your time, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I want to just say that next month we have a treat backed by very popular demand, our 2 women talking about women as leaders, and more to come on that. But Chris, thank you so much.